There are some sounds that don't belong to the living, and I learned that on a quiet Thursday morning while standing beside my husband's casket when his phone rang like it still had business with this world. My name is Loretta James. I turned 68 last fall, right there in Baltimore, where I've lived most of my life. I've buried friends before, even a sister, but I had never buried a man I shared my name with. I stood there with my hands folded low, not out of strength, but because I didn't know where else to put them. People kept touching my shoulder like I was something fragile that might fall apart if they didn't hold me in place. The church smelled like polished wood and old hymn books, the kind that have been opened more times in grief than in joy. Sunlight came through those tall windows, soft and respectful, like even the light understood it had no place being loud. I remember thinking, as I looked at his face laid still, that death had a way of making everything look settled, even things that never truly found peace while they were still breathing. I met Harold when I was 22, back when the world still felt like something you could plan. He wasn't a loud man, never had to be, the kind of presence that filled a room without announcing itself, steady like a clock that never missed a second. We built our life the slow way, no shortcuts, no sudden rises, just work, patience, and small victories that didn't look like much to anyone else but meant everything to us. A home, 2 children, Sunday dinners that rarely changed but always felt enough. I believe love was something you proved by staying, by not leaving when things got quiet or difficult. Harold believed that too, or at least I thought he did. We didn't say it often, but we lived it in ways that didn't need explaining. There were no grand gestures between us, no flowers just because, no letters left on pillows, but there was consistency. And at that time in my life, consistency felt like the safest form of love a woman could ask for. Looking back now, I can see that sometimes what feels safe can also be what keeps you from asking the questions you should have been asking all along. The first time I noticed something shifting, it wasn't anything I could point to, just a pause where there used to be ease. Harold began answering questions like he was choosing his words more carefully than before, even when the questions were simple. He started stepping outside more often to take his calls, said it was about work, said he didn't want to disturb me. I accepted that explanation because it came without hesitation, and I had never known him to lie without reason. At dinner, there were moments when he seemed present in body, but somewhere else in mind. I would be talking, and he would nod, but his eyes didn't always meet mine the way they used to. I told myself people change with time. I didn't confront him. Not because I didn't notice, but because I believed in giving space. I thought love meant allowing a person to go through their seasons without forcing them to explain every shift in the wind. Now I understand that silence can be a kindness, but it can also be a place where truth quietly learns how to hide. As the years went on, those small differences settled into something that felt normal, even though it wasn't. Harold became more private, not secretive in a way that raised alarms, but closed off just enough to create distance I couldn't measure. Our children had grown and moved into lives of their own. The house became quieter, and in that quiet, I began to notice the absence of things I had once taken for granted. Conversations shortened, laughter became less frequent. Still, there was no argument to point to, no betrayal I could name, just a slow drifting that didn't feel urgent enough to fight. I told myself this is what long marriages look like when the years settle in. Sometimes I would watch him from across the room, wondering what thoughts he carried that he never brought home to me. But I never asked. I believed that if something mattered enough, he would share it. I held on to that belief longer than I should have because it allowed me to stay comfortable in a truth that wasn't complete. The day Harold passed, it was quiet, almost gentle. He had been sitting in his chair, the same one he always favored near the window. The morning had started like any other, with coffee and a brief conversation about nothing in particular. There was no warning in his voice, no sign that anything was about to change. He simply leaned back, closed his eyes, and by the time I reached him, he was already gone, in a way I could not call back. The doctors said it was his heart. Quick, they said, peaceful. Words that are meant to comfort, but don't quite reach the places they are supposed to. Because no matter how it happens, loss still arrives without permission. In the days that followed, I moved through arrangements like someone following instructions written for another person, signing papers, choosing clothes, deciding what hymns would be sung. None of it felt like something I was prepared to do. Grief didn't come all at once. It stood at a distance, watching me, waiting for the moment when I would no longer have tasks to hide behind. At the funeral, people spoke kindly about Harold. They remembered him as dependable, thoughtful, a man who did what was expected of him. I listened to those words and nodded, because they were not untrue. But as I stood there, I realized how much of a person can exist outside of what others see. Even a husband, even a man you have shared decades with, can carry parts of himself that never cross the threshold of home. The service moved along in the way these things do, songs, prayers, voices rising and falling in familiar patterns. I stayed composed, not out of strength, but because I had not yet reached the place where my emotions had somewhere to land. Then, just as the final prayer was being spoken, a sound cut through the room, soft at first, then unmistakable, a ringing. Not from the living, not from the pockets of those gathered, but from somewhere closer. People shifted slightly, looking around, unsure of where it was coming from. But I knew. Before anyone said a word, before anyone moved, I knew exactly what I was hearing. And in that moment, something inside me went still in a way I had never felt before. The funeral director stepped forward, his movements careful, respectful. He leaned slightly toward the casket, then paused, as if even he was unsure whether to cross that boundary. The ringing continued, steady and patient. Someone whispered that it must have been left in his jacket. Another voice suggested turning it off, but no one moved quickly. There was a hesitation in the room, like we were all aware that this was not an ordinary interruption. I felt my feet carry me forward before I had made the decision to move. Each step felt measured, not rushed, as though something in me understood that whatever waited at the end of that walk could not be undone. When I reached Harold's still form, his face looked the same as it had moments before, peaceful, distant. But now there was something else in the air, something that did not belong to stillness. The phone kept ringing, and with each second it felt less like a call and more like a question I had not been prepared to answer. The director looked at me, waiting, as though I had the right to decide what should happen next. And I suppose I did. I nodded once, slow and certain, even though I did not fully understand what I was agreeing to. He reached carefully into the inside pocket of Harold's suit and retrieved the phone. The sound grew clear as it came into the open, filling the quiet space between breaths and whispered prayers. He hesitated before handing it to me, but I extended my hand anyway. My fingers felt steady, even though something deeper inside me had begun to shift in ways I could not yet name. The screen was lit, the name displayed clearly enough that I did not need to strain my eyes. It was not a number I recognized, not a name that had ever been spoken in my home. I stared at it longer than I should have, not because I didn't understand what I was seeing, but because I was beginning to understand more than I had ever allowed myself to consider. I did not answer the call, not because I was afraid, but because I knew that whatever truth lived on the other side of that ringing did not need to be heard in that moment to be real. The phone stopped after a while, the silence returning just as gently as it had been broken, but the room felt different now. Not to anyone else, perhaps, but to me, something had shifted beyond what could be undone. I handed the phone back without a word. The service continued, voices resuming their places as if nothing had happened, and I stood there, holding a truth that no one else in that room had witnessed. In that moment, I understood that grief was not going to be the only thing I carried away from that day. There was something else now, something quieter but heavier. And it was not about him being gone. It was about what had never been fully present while he was here. After the burial, when the house had emptied and the quiet returned, I sat alone in the same chair Harold used to favor. His phone rested on the table beside me, no longer ringing, no longer asking anything. I could have opened it, could have searched for answers, traced the calls, read messages that might have explained what I had begun to understand, but I did not reach for it. Some truths do not need confirmation. They reveal themselves in the spaces between what was said and what was avoided, and I had lived in those spaces longer than I had realized. What I had to admit to myself was not about him alone. It was about the ways I had chosen comfort over clarity, patience over truth, the ways I had accepted distance as something natural instead of something to be understood. I did not feel anger, not in the way people expect. What I felt was a quiet release, like setting down something I had been carrying without knowing its weight. And in that silence, I finally understood that love without honesty is only half a life lived.